So thanks, Karen and Kate and Marianne, for putting this together and for inviting me here. I've been a postdoc here since late 2013 when I defended my dissertation at Carleton. And I was going to talk about my dissertation in this talk, but I found that I didn't really have time to, so I'm happy to answer questions about it, and especially how it relates to my postdoc, which isn't totally clear probably. But I've been really blessed coming back here to Trent and to Peterborough, where I did my MA and my undergrad. And there's a really great community of people here, and in particular my supervisor Jim Struthers and my office mate Lisa, who's presenting today, have been really great to talk about my research with, but it's nice to have a larger community here to talk to. So my research here at Trent has been on what scholars traditionally have called the rediscovery of poverty, but I call the charisma of poverty. In the 60s, everyone wanted to be associated with poverty and to seem to be authoritative about it. The 1960s was arguably the high point of egalitarian democracy, high rates of unionization, and high rates of education. Access to higher education was unprecedented, and access to home ownership. Home ownership was an option for more and more people. So with a large section of the working class better off than previous generations, and especially than the generation of the 1930s, the minority of Canadians who were living in poverty became an object of fascination. This fascination was only partly political in the strict sense. I argue that the attraction of poverty in the period was to a large extent a function of the power of existentialism in the period. To be poor in the 1960s was to live a dangerous life, a life without illusions and without guarantees, which really broke them from the mainstream. So while a good portion of writing of the poor reflected a genuine concern about the poor and a desire to widen the welfare state, even that writing reflects a fascination with the poor as an alien people who have a moral for us to decode for ourselves. So in the early 1960s, up until 66 or 67, when books and articles and films and reports started to proliferate, this idea of the poor as a special people with magic powers, with a charisma that everybody else can learn from, dominated. So I came to this topic in large part because I'm concerned, like a lot of welfare state historians, with the decline of the post-war redistributive state in the 1980s and 1990s and with its historical underpinnings. So during the middle years of the 20th century, the federal and provincial states together played a significant role in redistributing incomes in Canada through a combination of universal programs and targeted programs. Revenue generated from income taxation was redistributed to lower income Canadians. The effect of this was never as good as proponents would want it to be, and particularly in the 1960s, the tax system was criticized for being not as progressive as it could have been. But the fact remains that the state was effective in redistributing incomes in this period. And from the 1970s on, the effects of the redistributive effects of the state became controversial and were subject to increasing attacks that by the 1990s were successful in significantly blunting the redistributive effects of the state. So my main motivation in studying the charisma of poverty has been to trace its role in sort of seeding the ground for the neoliberal attacks on redistribution in the decades that followed. Interestingly, redistribution was of almost no interest to people writing about poverty in the 1960s. In fact, you could read almost everything that anybody wrote about poverty in the 1960s and have no idea, if you read nothing else, you'd have no idea that there was any redistribution happening in the period. Poverty was fascinating for reasons other than, for non-material reasons. So the fact that welfare rates were too low for people to actually live on was of limited concern. The 1960s provided no useful material for later generations to use in defending the redistributive state. In fact, it could be argued that the production of images of poverty in the period that obscured the redistributive relations and even the social relations that produced poverty had a negative effect on defending of the welfare state later on. contributing to the perception that the redistributive state was not, in fact, redistributive, which it was. So my focus so far in my research, in the first year or so of my research, has been on the federal government's contribution to anti-poverty. The federal government played a powerful role as an organizer and enabler of other people's projects in the period. The office responsible for doing this was the Special Planning Secretariat, an arm of the Privy Council office that was tasked with linking the Pearson government's legislative agenda, welfare state programs, and so on, with the charisma of poverty. The Secretariat was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. It foreshadowed the power of the political center because it came from the Prime Minister's office at the expense of line departments like health and welfare that were actually generating these programs. And the decades that have followed have seen an increasing centralization of political power in the PMO and the Privy Council office. It also hinted at a new perspective on the redistributive state in which programs were seen as a single whole, and bureaucrats in line departments were seen as sort of dangerous empire builders who were building administrative fiefdoms, contributing to a sort of seeding the ground for a neoliberal attack on the welfare state. The Secretariat also worked in partnership with filmmakers working in the National Film Board and with anti-poverty activists, many of them working in the Company of Young Canadians, to produce an amazing amount of material describing and representing poverty, presumably to a population that was not poor. All this material, by explicit design, focused on the particularities of the poor as people, as opposed to the general society and their role in relation to rich people and to the economy as a whole. This project of promoting a cultural understanding of poverty that abstracted the poor from social relations and underscored the authenticity and existential grit of the poor was much more immediately successful than the Secretariat's strategic approach to government, which had to be picked up by later generations of bureaucrats. As I embark on the last few months of my postdoc, it's kind of terrifying to think about that, my research is shifting into the very final stages of the rediscovery of poverty, which is also the end of the 1960s. The investigations of the Special Senate Committee on Poverty, chaired by David Traill, so it's called the Traill Committee. The Traill Committee heard from community organizations, charitable associations, and academics in various cities over a 2-year period. There's volumes and volumes of material to go through. The Traill process is important and interesting for 2 reasons that are mostly unrelated. On the one hand, the hearings were the first large-scale gathering of all the various small-scale local anti-poverty organizations that had been working for a number of years, and in relation to the large-scale government-led anti-poverty programs. And each one of these projects could be a book-length project of their own. So the scale of what's in that material is overwhelming. As it is, the hearings and briefs are an excellent source on how on-the-ground activists saw the redistributive state in the period, which is the reason I'm interested in it. The other reason the Traill process is important in terms of the narrative arc of anti-poverty is that it's the first ground of explicit disagreement between a dominant, bureaucratic, technocratic, liberal understanding of poverty that came from the government and from the committee as a whole, and a new critical or radical understanding of poverty that came from the New Left, from the staff of the committee, which ultimately produced its own separate report that was arguably wider read than the official one. The Traill process is the first time that the New Left shakes off the existential baggage and confronts poverty as an actual material condition. And that's pretty clear in the text that poverty is about not having enough money. It's the first time the New Left has ever articulated that position. Belatedly, the New Left becomes suspicious of the motives of liberal anti-poverty, which had been, the New Left and liberal projects had been aligned through most of the 60s, and sees the existentialism as a breeding ground for an attack on the welfare state. And the dynamic through the 1970s is these local anti-poverty organizations allied with graduates of the New Left fighting against retrenchment of the welfare state that begins under the Trudeau government. So thanks a lot for listening to me here, and I'm excited to hear the rest of the presentations.
Thanks again to Karen and Marianne and Kate for bringing us all together. I'm very aware that my time at Trent is coming to an end, sadly. So it's nice to have events like this in the last few months that I'm here. What I'm going to do today is give you a very small little slice of my forthcoming book, as Marianne told us about, and just a little piece of it from one of the chapters, and draw some connections from between that story and my postdoc research. So my book, Working Mothers and the Childcare Dilemma, is a story of key moments in BC's history when working mothers and their childcare arrangements were high on the public and political agenda, and it covers most of the 20th century in BC. Moments throughout the 20th century. What I found in researching these moments and trying to tell the story of BC childcare history was this persistent and deeply rooted uneasiness about working motherhood that became embedded into state policies. And British Columbians, and I think this is true of Canadians as a whole, generally throughout the 20th century thought about working mothers in one of two ways: either that they were selfish, or that they were pitiable and in need of reform and rehabilitation somehow. So the limited childcare policies and programs that were developed by the state were largely directed towards this latter category, those working mothers who were thought to be sort of a signal of family breakdown somehow. Offering childcare was kind of an uneasy compromise. While everyone agreed that mothers should really be staying home to look after their own children, these welfare-oriented childcare services could at least serve to get poor mothers to work, thereby promoting family self-sufficiency and promoting a healthy work ethic in working class and poor families, preventing chronic dependency on the state, and helping to meet the demand for low-paid workers in sectors of the economy where women most often worked. So in my book, I argue that these attitudes about childcare became deeply entrenched in the early part of the 20th century, and they continue to shape the policy landscape today, even though working mothers, as we know, have become more and more common and necessary in Canadian families. So we're still sort of living in this policy rut that we've carved out over decades of ambivalence about working motherhood, which today has left us in a pretty dismal place in terms of Canadian childcare, and I don't need to tell many of you the details of that. But suffice to say, Canada consistently ranks lowest among developed countries in terms of early childhood care and education. So a couple of weeks ago, Dave and I co-organized a conference called a workshop really, called the Future History of the Welfare State. And a few of us were lamenting how depressing it can be to have to document the inadequacies of Canadian social policy. And Joan Sangster reminded us usefully, I think, that hope and optimism can be found in stories of mobilization. People coming together to offer alternatives and push for change. So that's what I'm going to highlight today. I've been reflecting on that ever since. So today I'm going to highlight a group of Vancouver women in the 1970s who called themselves the Childcare Occupation Forces. And they appear in a chapter in my book. So in August 1972, Dave Barrett's NDP government in BC was voted in, putting an end to a 20-year social credit reign that had mostly neglected childcare, not surprisingly. The new minister responsible for daycare is a Minister of Rehabilitation and Social Improvement. His name was Norm Levi, and daycare was actually quite high on his agenda. So by the fall of 1972 and through the winter of 72-73, the NDP announced a plan for what they called new daycare, which included promises for more spaces, more funding to both parents and daycare groups, and less complicated bureaucracy to ensure that all who needed daycare subsidies received them. And that was the main provincial policy, was to offer subsidies to low-income families. The daycare community in BC, so parents and childcare providers and others, reacted to this announcement with cautious optimism. But when more detailed plans were rolled out throughout the winter and spring, they found themselves largely disappointed. One study indicated that even with Levi's reforms, fewer than 10% of children under 6 of working mothers in Vancouver would be served by the provincial daycare program. And perhaps most disappointingly, Levi and Premier Barrett refused to talk about licensing for daycare centers for children under 3 years old. This is a big demand of the daycare community, meaning that working mothers with infants and toddlers had few daycare options other than unregulated home-based care. A big part of this new daycare plan was the establishment of a provincial daycare information center in Vancouver. Sort of a clearinghouse for resources and information. So the grand opening of the center was February 1st, 1973. And on that day, a large group of women and parents from daycare centers in the city gathered to protest the government's inadequate plans. Originally intended as sort of a rally in protest, as one participant recalled, someone asked if it was a sit-in, so it became a sit-in. With that, the childcare occupation forces were born. Over the course of 11 days, mothers, along with their children, occupied the daycare office and essentially transformed it into their own community childcare center, complete with changing tables on bureaucrats' desks. They cared for children, and they composed protest songs, which is where the title of this talk comes from, Talkin' Daycare Blues. And they also put together a list of policy demands. They called for licensing for under 3 centers, 24-hour-a-day care, increased subsidies to parents, and government support for community-based childcare initiatives, among other things. Their list of demands could fill 10 minutes. They also released materials that placed their demands for childcare firmly within the larger goal of women's liberation, so they identified as feminists. Adequate daycare was not just about children's interests, they said, although that was certainly key, but about making the care of children a collective responsibility of society, so that women had the freedom to go to work, to go to school, and to pursue other interests, to be fully participating citizens in society. The occupation forces managed to get Norm Levi and a couple other ministers, of health and education, I think, to come down to the offices for meetings. Levi came down several times, actually. But perhaps not surprisingly, the meetings weren't very productive, and eventually the occupation itself fizzled out. In terms of policy, the occupation didn't change much. The NDP and then the social credit government, which was returned in 1975, continued to view daycare as something primarily for welfare families and poor single mothers. So it was a very targeted program. But the occupation generated and built upon activist energy and enthusiasm in Vancouver. Women involved in the sit-in had been involved in feminist childcare co-ops around the city, particularly on campuses of SFU and UBC. Inspired by the sit-in, the members of the Vancouver Women's Caucus released, these are a few other pictures from the occupation. The Vancouver Women's Caucus released this book shortly after the occupation called "'Cause There Ain't No Daycare, or Almost None," she said. And this is a thick book that contained tips about setting up daycare co-ops and community centers, as well as more sort of ideologically focused feminist essays about the need for universal daycare. In 1973, a group of daycare societies formed the BC Childcare Federation to act as a vehicle for putting collective pressure on the government to improve childcare. And they began to publish a Ragamuffin, which was later known as Growing Pains, a newsletter for daycare information and advocacy. Now, this is just a small sampling of things that were happening in the daycare advocacy community. Altogether, these and other events of the early and mid-1970s set in motion a childcare movement in BC that through the following decades would come to include childcare workers, welfare rights groups, women's organizations, anti-poverty activists, the list goes on. So the history of childcare advocacy and activism forms a significant part of my postdoc research as well. I've moved beyond BC's borders to examine the history of childcare politics around the country, beginning with the Second World War. Among other things, I'm interested in how the framing of childcare advocacy has changed in the second half of the century. The BC advocates were not alone in the 1970s in mobilizing for childcare reforms as part of the feminist project of women's equality that was happening around the country in the late 60s and 70s. But over the course of several decades and really up to today, I think, the framework of advocacy efforts has shifted, likely to adjust to prevailing political winds, meaning that childcare gets framed as a children's issue, a family issue, as an anti-poverty issue, as an economic issue, as a business issue. What's troubling, though, is that more recently, a feminist framework for advocacy has begun to disappear, perhaps as a strategic move on the part of advocates who don't want to risk alienating rightward-turning governments. I think it's worth remembering, especially now that childcare is back on the political agenda in the lead up to the 2015 election, that the roots of the childcare fight lay in these feminist campaigns in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think they remind us not to sidestep questions of feminism and gender injustice in this larger picture of contemporary childcare advocacy. And overall, I think this speaks to the need for tracing the historical threads, these sort of contested meanings and purposes of childcare in Canadian society, which is what I intend to do with my postdoc research.
So as the introduction said, I'm currently in the process of completing a book project, History of the Joint Arctic Weather Stations with Whitney Lackenbauer at the University of Waterloo. My talk today borrows from this work and my contributions to the project, and also has some overlap with a post that I just put on Niche today, actually, on their website, on their blog. So to introduce the JAWS stations themselves. They were constructed from 1947 to 50. You can see them high on the archipelago. They were constructed largely at the behest of and design of the American government. Canada and the US collaboratively operated these stations until 1972, at which point they were Canadianized, and I'd be glad to discuss that process in questions later if you want. Each of these stations were civilian run and collected synoptic weather data by making surface observations and by flying weather balloons carrying either radiosondes or RONSondes high into the atmosphere to collect temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction, and humidity twice a day. The data these stations gathered was crucial to military planning as the Cold War moved into the high Arctic, but it was also critical for civilian meteorology, transatlantic commercial aviation, North American agriculture, and the lumber industry. Aside from the resupply season, however, these stations had little contact with the South. In fact, until the 1960s, the satellite stations, so the ones along the west coast of the archipelago, were entirely unreachable by air during the dark period. It was a very lonely place to be, these 8-man weather stations. My contributions to the book project with myself and Whitney include analyzing how the Arctic environment impacted the station's scientific cultures. The JAWS program suggests the need for science and environmental historians to pay more attention to the significance of technicians. Most scholarly research we've seen to date focuses on scientists with university educations going up to these places and doing research. An emerging scholarship is also developing, looking at amateurs, such as hobbyists, contributing to scientific discourses and perhaps challenging or at least complicating scientists' claim on authority to scientific knowledge and environmental knowledge. Now, meteorological technicians, or METTECs as they were known, weren't scientists, but they were the ones who encoded and they were the ones who conducted the observations at these stations, and they encoded the data that was sent south. They generally lacked undergraduate, let alone graduate degrees. They were, however, professionally trained. They weren't amateurs. Canadian METTECs, for example, had to pass 7 months of courses at the Department of Transport before heading south. These were graduates from the 1956 class in Toronto. When these men arrived at the stations, they participated in the creation of a scientific place. They valued the powers of observation as well as accuracy, consistency, and repetition, or repeatability. Yet they could not analyze the data they gathered, and they were not indoctrinated to desire the placeless ideal that Southern scientists often desired to impose upon the North, and often were frustrated when they couldn't. Moreover, these METTECs resided at the station for a year or more at a time, and consequently contrasted sharply with scientists who often came for weeks or perhaps months at most to these stations during the summer months when transportation was easier. So the JAWS program thus offers unique opportunities to compare and contrast the scientific cultures that were constructed at these stations in an extreme environment. Now, as I've said, JAWS METTECs understood the scientific importance of taking regular and consistent observations. Only the most extreme situations frustrated their perseverance. At some stations, such as Alert, balloon releases were eased by considerably lower winds, on average. At other stations, such as Isaacson, however, strong prevailing winds made launching these balloons quite difficult. They basically, as the balloon rose, you had this long cord, and if you didn't run with your meteorological instrument, your radiosonde, it would get dragged across the ground and beaten to a pulp before it ever got in the air, right? And because you need to have regular observations, this would require a second, even a third, occasionally even a fourth launch before you got the thing in the air and could track it and gather the data wirelessly. Over time, METTECs innovated a variety of techniques for successful launches under adverse conditions. To protect their latex radiosonde balloons against puncturing or stretching during high winds, releases, for example, METTECs at Resolute developed a shroud that they would use to encase the balloon and hold it to bring it out of the shelter so that it didn't bang across the door and get stretched out or punctured. It gave you more control. But there was a problem. The difficulty of airlifting bulk helium to the stations, which had to be done in canisters like you see stacked along the side here, you couldn't do it in bulk because they weighed a lot and they were very bulky, very expensive to ship to these remote stations that in many cases the satellite stations could only be reached by aircraft. So instead the stations produced hydrogen, much more explosive gas, on site by mixing various chemicals. Now, the shroud that they used, unfortunately, had this bad habit of creating static charges. And with a hydrogen-filled balloon, you can imagine, I don't know whether this was discovered by accident or whether somebody put it together, I assume the latter, and realized you probably shouldn't be using the shroud with hydrogen-filled balloons. So as a consequence, the shroud's use initially in the early 1950s was limited to Resolute, a station that had a much larger runway, year-round landings, and consequently had a supply of helium at hand. By 1953, however, all of the stations received limited supplies of bottled helium and were able to also use shrouds for their own launches in high wind situations only. Most of the time they continued to use hydrogen because it was cheaper to bring in. With this method, as John Llewellyn, who was Isaacson's executive officer in 1965, noted in the station diary, and I quote, we noted with satisfaction that we have never failed to get a balloon instrument aloft, now that they had this technique. Again, creating reliability by innovating in the field. Now, METTECs also experimented in other ways to improve the low burst altitudes that they suffered during flights and during the dark period. This is, of course, during the winter. The air gets very cold, especially at altitude, and the problem was the balloons went brittle, and they were exploding much, much earlier than they were supposed to. A balloon flight had to reach a minimum of 50,000 feet, approximately, for the flight to be valuable for meteorologists. If it was less than that, you had to launch another balloon. And these balloons were brittle, exploding too early. So METTECs at Eureka began experimenting in the early 1950s by soaking the balloons in diesel oil. Why, you ask? At the low temperatures of the Arctic environment, it coagulated into a honey-like consistency that gave the balloons back some of its stretchability, so that as it rose at high altitudes and the balloon expands as the air gets thinner, the balloon wouldn't burst prematurely. The procedure varied over time, but multiple stations employed this technique, this diesel soaking method, to achieve flights of over 100,000 feet at times during the winter months. Some Southern officials objected to these practices because, and I quote, the diesel fuel would rub off on a person's clothes, and before long the odor would permeate all of the living quarters of these rather small stations and would additionally be a fire hazard. Yeah, sure. These warnings, however, don't appear to have had a lasting effect, and although the diesel soaking never became official policy as far as I can tell, it remained quite widespread. In the early 1970s, METTECs continued to be excited by the improved altitudes that they were achieving during the dark period by employing diesel soaking. Now, despite the shared experiences and similar outlooks that scientists and METTECs had, they also recognized that there were differences in training and the transitory experience of the scientists versus the weather observers. You think I'm just being seasonal with Easter. No, there's more to it than this. Sometimes the scientists and the weather station personnel kind of highlighted these professional differences by pulling practical jokes on each other that highlighted the professional differences. In the mid-1950s, for example, a visiting ornithologist, bird scientist, ran into the station at Resolute and warned that there was a couple of polar bears on the shore. Now you have to understand, at the time, standard procedure, if a bear got close enough to camp, you got your rifles, you went out and you shot it. The common wisdom being, if you didn't, sometime during the night, or Lord knows when, the polar bear would, ambush some unsuspecting Weather Bureau personnel, right? This was the common wisdom. So instantly, the weather station personnel grabbed a bunch of rifles, they went out, they saw the bear on the beach, and they started hammering away at it. But the bear didn't drop. As they got closer, they eventually noticed this bear was made of snow, it had coal for eyes, They were alleviating the boredom, and this scientist had pulled a joke on the people whose job was in part to keep the station running, keep it safe. But the crew got even. The METTECs got back at the ornithologist. Where am I? The ornithologist spent his days collecting bird eggs at Resolute. So, and I'm quoting from the gentleman who pulled the prank, we took some of the chicken eggs and painted little brown dots all over them and laid them out there and kind of helped him find them. And then he came back all excited because he'd found these weird eggs he couldn't identify, right? Again, highlighting the professional differences of these different types of scientific participants. Both sides had good laughs at the expense of each other's duties and expertise, in short. Now, JAWS METTECs participated in scientific culture, as I've said. They innovated operating procedures that better suited the Arctic environment and contributed to data sets that were useful for Southern scientists. This culture led them to persevere in the harshest environmental conditions, including upper air flights and a host of other meteorological and environmental observation programs. But technicians, of course, aren't unique to the Joint Arctic Weather Stations. Technicians participate in a whole host of scientific disciplines. And I'm hoping this talk will encourage us as social scientists to investigate their contributions to the collection of scientific data and scientific culture in general. If we don't, I think we'll have difficulty recognizing the contributions that these men, and subsequently women by the 1970s, at least in the case of JAWS, made to these scientific places. And I think social scientists will also struggle to understand the extent and nature of scientific culture, its geographic space perhaps, and its demographic space, as well as the practical feasibility of how governments, will have difficulty assessing how governments assess the feasibility of creating stations like this. They often relied upon technicians' expertise and visionaries' expertise to determine future construction and programs. And lastly, we'll have difficulty understanding how non-scientists at remote outposts like the JAWS stations contributed to the expansion of the state in remote regions such as the High Archipelago. Thank you.
I feel like we're in a contest to tell you a story as quickly as we can. Yeah, at first I thought I might just talk about my research process, and then I thought once I talked to David and Lisa, I would try to actually tell you a bit about some of the research I've done. So as my introduction mentioned, my dissertation looked at the Six Nations of Grand River in the 20th century. And so I figured logically the next thing to do in the postdoc would be to go backwards, which is not normally how you should do it. But so I've been looking at the 19th century. I started with Grand River because that's the community I'm most familiar with, and then I've moved over and looked at Tyendinaga, and you'll get to see both of those communities briefly. So I'm going to tell you a story. In 1860, a 20-year-old Mohawk woman by the name of Catherine Loft took it upon herself to become trained and granted a certificate from the County Board of Public Instruction as a teacher in Hastings County. This woman lived on a farm on the Mohawk Reserve, known first as the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and later became known as Tyendinaga, which is what it's known as today, just west of Kingston. She was most likely educated in one of the reserve missionary day schools, where most of the children went. That she undertook such training herself in order to be hired to teach is somewhat extraordinary. She must have been very intelligent, capable, and clearly very proactive. And yet she was not hired by the Mohawk counselors to teach in one of the local schools because she was a woman, despite the fact that she had the backing of the local missionary and the superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs. So the focus of this paper is this one woman, Catherine Loft Klaus, who is likely the first Mohawk woman certified to teach in Ontario, and I think very possibly the first Indigenous woman certified to teach in Canada, and three of her cousins, Lydia Hill, Elizabeth Martin Powless, and a woman named Yagawia or Jemima Loft Beaver. And I'll show you a slide with all of their names shortly. So these four women that I'll just tell you very briefly a little bit about each one of them in this paper, they were all related by cousins by blood and marriage. And interestingly, I think they were all descended from several of the important leaders in the Mohawk communities, both at Tyendinaga and at Grand River. Despite the challenges that they faced because they were women teachers, their efforts and careers teaching Haudenosaunee children in missionary and government-run day schools were part of a long tradition of women in education. Okay, so I'm not telling you very much about the communities themselves because I don't have time, but in this map here you can see here's Tyendinaga and Six Nations of Grand River. And these were Iroquois, or now we tend to say Haudenosaunee communities, they originally came from New York. They were located in upstate New York. During the American Revolution, some people joined with the British and some joined with the Americans. Those who joined with the British were the losers and came up to Canada after the American Revolution. So that's why we have these communities spread all around. I have 2 pages on that, but no time to tell you all the details. So this paper is particularly focused on the efforts of a missionary company called the New England Company to Christianize and educate the Six Nations. And to this end, numerous schools were established throughout these communities. And some were new schools entirely built, and others were built to replace older schools. And this began in the early 1800s. From quite early on, missionaries and New England Company staff realized that it would be more economical and more practical to hire educated teachers from within the community itself, rather than bringing in teachers from outside, which is what they were generally doing. An 1840 New England Company report argues, quote, "It is very desirous of completing the education of at least a few girls, that they may be qualified to instruct the younger children." And the officials also realized that people in the community were more happy to send their children to school if the teacher at the front of the class was from the community itself, as opposed to a white person from outside. And it wasn't just that Native teachers encouraged a positive feeling in the general population towards schooling, but also that they were more efficient in their teaching, obviously, because they could better communicate with their students. And there's also sorts of reports saying how the pupils evidently understood what they were learning because the teachers spoke in Mohawk. As a result, throughout the 1860s, the majority of the schools had Indigenous teachers working at them, both male and female. And not to say that all of them had all Indigenous teachers, but most of the schools had them. So I, for this project, have taken a microbiographical approach. I know you can't read any of the names on there. You may recognize that as from Ancestry.ca, which has taken over genealogy in North America. And it's the best, easiest place to make trees. So in my research, I tend to take this approach and to try to learn as much as I can about individuals and families so that the broader contours of the social and cultural landscape become more clear. These women themselves did not leave very many records of their own. There's no journals or diaries or anything of the sort. And they're briefly mentioned in missionary, government, and public records. I have photos of a couple of them. And yet from all of this, I think there's enough information to be able to discern or paint a picture of the work that these female teachers did in these two particular communities in the late 19th century. And importantly, from my own research, how their careers were affected by their gender. So I mentioned the four names, there they are. So I began with Catherine Loft and her unsuccessful bid to find employment as a certified teacher in 1860. So she was a great-granddaughter of Captain Isaac Hill. He was a very well-known Mohawk warrior who fought along Captain John Deserantion in the Revolution. And this was the man that led Mohawk people to the region west of Kingston that became known as Tyendinaga. So he was an important leader. Catherine was born at Tyendinaga, and by the time she was 18 years old, she comes to the attention of the visiting superintendent of Indian Affairs, a man named William Bartlett. And there's quite a lot of discussion of her in the Department of Indian Affairs records, which is fantastic for my purposes. Nothing written by her, but quite a few things written about her. So he noted that she was, quote, endeavoring to qualify herself for a school teacher, and that she intended going before the Board of Examiners with the view of obtaining a certificate when she hoped to be appointed to the Indian school. And the superintendent thought this was very proper and desirable, he said. And he was supportive of having Mohawk teachers working in the schools. They knew they would be most successful that way. The following year, he wrote to the Mohawk counselors, to the chief, saying that he had heard that she had been granted her certificate from the County Board of Public Instruction, and he said, quote, "This is highly creditable to her, and it ought to be gratifying to you to find one of your own band, thus taking advantage of the means of education provided to the Mohawks, and by perseverance and study to qualify herself for a school teacher." Now, he suggested that she be hired for 3 months on a trial basis, and then they could decide if she was satisfactory and that the council could decide on her salary. At the time, there were 3 school trustees that were in charge of hiring for the 2 schools on the reserve. One was a man named Anderson, who was the missionary, and the other 2 were Mohawk chiefs, named Seth Hill and Nelson Martin. Now, in some of the letters, the missionary says, you know, if this young woman is discouraged, it may deter others from trying to improve their education. So she has the support of the superintendent and the missionary. Despite this, the 2 Mohawk chiefs, who are the school trustees, would not approve of the proposal to hire Catherine on a trial basis. They actually gathered their supporters and threatened that if she was hired, they would make their children turn her out of the school. These same counselors had previously been critical of the white, male, and non-certified teacher, a man named Mr. Garrett, but suddenly they began to support him, which is obviously just awful. When the issue came before the council in the summer of 1860, the councillors, quote, strenuously objected to hiring Catherine Loft for 2 reasons, according to Bartlett. Quote, the first, that it was as much as a man could do to manage and control unruly boys. And second, that her English pronunciation was imperfect. Apparently, Catherine's father was so afraid to send her to the school to teach, even if she had been hired. He was afraid because she had been threatened by community members. What happened to Catherine Loft after she was not hired, after going through all this training, isn't clear. She married and eventually had 7 children, and we don't know too much about her later in her life. But we can speculate how she must have felt. She underwent all of this effort on her own, which was pretty extraordinary, to become a teacher. And I think she was trying to carry on in this tradition of Haudenosaunee women playing an important role in educating the young and passing on their history and culture and traditions. In the years following the Mohawk chief's decisions not to hire Catherine Loft or any woman to teach, women were being hired down the road at the Grand River. And while records are imperfect, I think that it's likely that the first woman to teach on the Grand River Reserve was a Mohawk woman known at the time as Mrs. Beaver. And I know quite a bit about each of these women and can only tell you a little. So she taught at several schools during the 1860s and 70s. The annual reports from the Department of Indian Affairs tell us that. So who is this woman? I kept seeing Mrs. Beaver mentioned in all of these reports. She was actually the first cousin once removed of Catherine Loft, and that's why I needed the tree, because they're all cousins sort of connected. She was also from Tyendinaga, had been born there in 1833. And by the 1850s, she and her sister and her brother, who you can see pictured there, had become traveling performers and Christian gospel singers. They traveled southern Ontario and upstate New York to raise money in order to print copies of Mohawk translations of the Bible. They attracted the attention of Susanna Moodie, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, who wrote about this family in her book, Life in the Clearings versus the Bush, in 1853. She said, Moody said, there is a Mohawk family who reside in this township of the name Loft, who have gained some celebrity in the colony by their clever representations of the manners and customs of their tribe. They sing Indian songs, dance the war dance, hold councils, and make grave speeches in the characters of Indian chiefs and hunters. So they clearly were attracting a lot of attention. Unfortunately, they were involved in a train accident. They were sitting at a train station. The 2 women were in the back of the train, and the brother went to go buy tickets, and a runaway train came and hit the back of the train, and Susanna was killed in 1852. So an obituary and sort of a memorial booklet was published, and that's what those documents are from, that talk about how her life really was spent in an effort to learn English, and then to be able to diffuse civilization and Christianity across the nation. So I don't know too much about this young woman's childhood, but she was definitely well educated, and she was concerned with the education of other Mohawk people. She ended up moving to Grand River in 1861. She married a man named John Beaver. And I think that her educational background, her experience as a performer, her faith as a Christian, all of these things colored her work as a teacher. Now, of course, what her students thought of her teaching, what she actually taught in the classroom, we have no idea. That's the problem with history. I wish everyone had to keep diaries. The third woman is another cousin, Elizabeth Martin Pellis, and I'll just tell you a tiny bit about her. She's one of the only people that I have a photograph of like this. She was a first cousin once removed as well. She was born in Grand River, again descended from Captain Isaac Hill, and also she's connected to Joseph Brant, who's a famous, infamous Mohawk man, and had connections to Pauline Johnson and other sort of famous Mohawk people. She's mentioned numerous times in the records of the New England Company, and she's never described very positively. And in fact, towards the end of her career, she's sort of encouraged to retire, and her son takes over her teaching position. And the last woman, Lydia Hill. So when I first started this research, I focused at Grand River, and I found that some of these teachers actually were coming from Tyendinaga and had Tyendinaga roots, which sort of surprised me. And yet it's clear that there was mobility in terms of employment between those two communities. Lydia Hill, her cousin, she's Catherine Loft's second cousin, and she actually becomes the first woman hired to teach at Tyendinaga in 1870, 10 years after the counselors refused to hire Catherine because she was a woman. Again, she has this genealogy. She's connected to Isaac Hill and also to Joseph Brant. She remained unmarried throughout her career, and she's the only woman, when I've done research on them, that actually has her career listed as school teacher. And I need to learn how to edit photos better so I could show you. I think it's here where it says that's her line there, and she's school teacher, which is very exciting because most women almost always just says none, right? They have no occupation, which is obviously a lie. This woman spent a year at the Mohawk Institute, the residential school at Grand River, doing a teacher training program. And then she started teaching at the Upper Mohawk School in 1870. And again, she's the first woman teaching there. And she taught for many years. Her obituary was one of these lovely obituaries that I've put up there that tells all sorts of interesting things about her life. She traveled through Western Canada, taught Sunday school, the organist at her church. A lot of that is very familiar to me in terms of what women were doing at Six Nations. She never married, but she did take in boarders. In 1911, for instance, she's listed as the head of a household of 13 people, including several boarders, men and their families. And I wish I've searched and haven't been able to find anything, but this trip to England, in the interest of education, I mean, that's something I wish I could find more on, and yet I can't. I haven't found anything yet. So these women, all of them were Anglican, which wasn't uncommon, and had a belief or a calling to share their faith through education. What they taught in the classroom is impossible to know, but it's likely that they taught some aspects of their own Haudenosaunee culture and history, along with the mission curriculum. And I know that Haudenosaunee women teachers were doing that in Grand River schools in the early 20th century, and that's the article that's coming out in Ontario History. However, of course, there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty that remains. And I'll just add at the end to say that I think there are connections between this and there's a school presently at Grand River that's a Mohawk language immersion school that was started in 1985 by Mohawk women who wanted more culture and history taught in their schools on the reserve. So I think the connections between these women in the 19th century and the present or the late 20th century are important. So I able to tie it all together. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. This is kind of exciting. It's neat to be here. I am with the ERS program up on main campus. I consider myself a Frost Center hanger-on, so I thought I would use today to kind of give everyone a general flavor of what my postdoc project is all about. My book project, my main book project at the moment, examines the active role of the state in resource management. And within that research, science is always in the background. It's always there. And science is generally categorized in one of two ways. It's either subservient to the state or it's subversive of the state. So moving on towards my postdoc, I was interested in kind of examining that sort of relationship in mid-20th century Canada, and here's some of that. I couldn't get a photo for this page, still looking. My ongoing major project examines the intersections of the fields of environmental history and the history of science and technology. My research investigates the influence of the state on scientific development and the reciprocal relationships between ecological science and resource management by focusing on the research of a group of government scientists from the 1940s to the 1970s, most of whom worked in Ontario. They created a new system of knowledge generation, which they labeled ecological land classification, by researching alternative methods to classify forests. The first comprehensive system of forest classification in Canada was published by W.E.D. Halliday in 1937. It was a two-level system that was literally defined from above, since climate was the major determinant. While Halliday's scheme remained the standard for the next several decades, some forest researchers were developing other methods to classify Canada's forests. Chief among these researchers was George Angus Hills. Originally a soil scientist, Hills became interested in forest classification through his work for the Ontario Department of Lands and Forests, where he classified crown lands suitable for agricultural settlement in the 1940s. In the 1950s and 1960s, Hills developed a new method to classify forests and eventually other landscapes and waterscapes. He did so by incorporating the work of prominent ecologists, such as Arthur Tansley and Howard and Eugene Odom. In the early 1950s, Hills introduced the ideas of a site region and total site classification, or the study of how the environmental characteristics of a specific site or area affect the growth of trees. Once classified, these could then be compared to other forest sites on three related scales: national, regional, and local. Simply classifying a forest site, though, was not enough. The site also had to be mapped and evaluated for the type of forest crop that would potentially best grow there. Overall, Hill's proposed method for classifying forests was a holistic three-level system that was defined from below. In 1961, Hills published his highly influential The Ecological Basis for Land Use Planning. In it, he examined a number of landscapes and waterscapes, framing them as biological productivity systems. He explained that biological productivity was the ability of a site to produce a crop of living organisms. Hills argued that land classification and sustainable management of natural resources had to be predicated on the types of living organisms that specific sites were best able to produce. Essentially, it was recognition that certain ecosystems, like bogs, might not be the best place to grow trees. It might actually serve more important purposes like water purification. Hills also provided a series of steps to follow when classifying and evaluating lands for different kinds of managed uses, that is, a system of ecological land classification. Through his role as mentor to colleagues and graduate students, and arguably the strength of his ideas, Hills' work became increasingly influential throughout the 1960s and 1970s. In 1961, the federal government launched the Canada Land Inventory to identify the best potential uses for abandoned farmlands across the country. Site methods developed by Hills and his colleagues were incorporated into the inventory, and Hills was a consultant with the program. By the 1970s, Hills' notion of ecological land classification was generally referred to, of all things, as the Hills method of land classification, a modernized version of which is still used by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, just down the hill. Additionally, in 1976, Environment Canada organized the first meeting of the Canada Committee on Ecological Land Classification. This was a committee to coordinate the classification and evaluation of public lands in Canada. There's a photo. So, to highlight the significance of my historical research, here are 4 key concepts that I'm developing as part of this project. The first one centers on the role of the state in the development of ecological science in post-Second World War Canada. As Sharon Kingsland and others have noted, the US government played a major role in shaping the development of ecology in that country through Cold War funding. I believe that there was a similar sort of broadly defined role occupied by the state in Canada from approximately the 1940s to the 1970s. Yet the guiding rationale behind the distribution of government funding in Canada had more to do with the rationalization of resource management. Federal and provincial funding for forest research in post-war Canada amounted to tens of millions of dollars. If you were to include similar funding schemes for sectors like agriculture, the fisheries, and mining, it would represent an incredible total sum, much of which influenced the development of ecology in Canada. My second concept pertains to the research centers through which much of this state funding would have been funneled, particularly those known as experimental areas or experimental stations. These focal points of scientific research have been present in Canada since the 19th century, focused on a variety of sectors from agriculture to the fisheries. By the 1950s, there were 5 federally operated forest experimental stations in different regions of the country, and a couple of provincially operated ones in richer jurisdictions like Ontario. I've conceived of these experimental areas as spaces of knowledge production, where state funding and priorities met the pursuit of science and melded to produce specific types of ecological knowledge. Hills and his colleagues, for example, developed most of their ideas while conducting research at forest experimental stations in Ontario and the Maritimes. And yet, this begs the question, where did the structural influence of the state end and the agency of the scientists begin? As government employees, to what degree did these scientists simply do as they were told, as defined by the government as the priorities of the government of the day? Or did they have a certain amount of leeway to conduct their research as they saw fit? Based on my postdoctoral research thus far, I believe it was a situation similar to Cold War-funded scientific projects in the US. Scientists were able to create space to pursue their general interest, but still produce types of knowledge that were deemed important by the state. The simple fact that Hills and his colleagues were researching an alternative method to classify forests and other landscapes and waterscapes speaks to this likelihood. It's a great photo. Those guys are actually labeling trees with numbers. Talk about quantifying nature, eh? So, on to my third concept, how to conceptualize the work and research of resource scientists. Inarguably, Hills and his colleagues pursued their research with economic considerations in mind. But the inclusion of ecological principles in their work demonstrates a sensitivity to the problems caused by human interactions with natural environments, non-human environments. I suggest that the research be generally placed within the broader tradition of pragmatic conservation that was fairly common in North America in the early to mid-20th century. Ben Mintier has described this form of conservation as a combination of economic pragmatism and environmental ethics. On a more specific level, we have to ensure that we differentiate between the various motivations and approaches of the individual scientists. Even at this stage in the project, a basic range of motivations can be discerned, from very pragmatic outlooks to quasi-deep ecology approaches. Perhaps one of the more important contributions of my postdoctoral research will be highlighting the reciprocal nature of knowledge exchange between the worlds of ecological science and resource management. At the crux of this exchange were resource scientists. I think it is certainly fair to say that resource science occupied a far more nuanced role within historical development than we often give it credit for. One of the main questions I always come back to is, what process did these particular scientists go through to go from unquestionably thinking of themselves as resource scientists in the 1940s and 1950s to the more often than not simply identifying as ecologists in the 1960s and 1970s? Of course, we also have to remember that many foresters and forest scientists would never have referred to themselves as ecologists during this period. Exploring the underlying reasons why some did and many did not is a key aspect of my project. For my final insight, I would like to briefly touch on the movement of scientific knowledge within what I call transnational ecological knowledge networks. There's a buzzword. The initial influence for the development of forest site theory in Canada came from Europe, particularly Scandinavia. The Canadian researchers also worked with soil scientists and foresters in the United States, especially researchers in the Adirondacks. Therefore, to what degree can we consider the work of Hills, his colleagues, and other scientists like them as being undertaken as a sort of Canadianization of ecological knowledge? I find this idea to be quite intriguing. Since they produce knowledge about Canadian landscapes, some of which are exclusive to Canada, is it possible to conceptualize Hills and his colleagues as conducting their research in contrast to the work of scientists in other countries? In other words, can we consider them to be part of and helping to form a Canadian school of ecology? While there has been a rich academic tradition of examining state development policies in Canada, much work remains to be done regarding when the from-above abstracted approach of the state encounters from-below realities on the ground. Much of what I have described here today strongly suggests that there was often a tension between the state's priority of resource rationalization and the site-specific work of individual scientists. It is my intention over the next several years to continue to pursue this vein of research, and I anticipate that it will form the core of my second monograph. Maybe. My study will help fill in some historiographical gaps, but I can even foresee the possibility of a broader, perhaps multi-institutional research project. The scope of the project could include a number of resource sectors, such as forestry, the fisheries, mining and agriculture, a range of Canadian landscapes and waterscapes, and potentially a wider time frame than the post-Second World War period. Such a project would go a long way toward exploring the intersections of the fields of environmental history and the history of science in Canada. And I'll just close on that image, which hints at some of my other research on comic books. Thanks.
For non-material reasons. So the fact that welfare rates were too low for people to actually live on was of limited concern. The 1960s provided no useful material for later generations to use in defending the redistributive state. In fact, it could be argued that the production of images of poverty in the period that obscured the redistributive relations and even the social relations that produced poverty had a negative effect on defending of the welfare state later on, contributing to the perception that the redistributive state was not, in fact, redistributive, which it was. So my focus so far in my research, in the first year or so of my research, has been on the federal government's contribution to anti-poverty. The federal government played a powerful role as an organizer and enabler of other people's projects in the period. The office responsible for doing this was the Special Planning Secretariat, an arm of the Privy Council office that was tasked with linking the Pearson government's legislative agenda, welfare state programs, and so on, with the charisma of poverty. The Secretariat was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. It foreshadowed the power of the political center because it came from the Prime Minister's office at the expense of line departments like health and welfare that were actually generating these programs. And the decades that have followed have seen an increasing centralization of political power in the PMO and the Privy Council office. The decline of the post-war redistributive state in the 1980s and 1990s and with its historical underpinnings. So during the middle years of the 20th century, the federal and provincial states together played a significant role in redistributing incomes in Canada through a combination of universal programs and targeted programs. Revenue generated from income taxation was redistributed to lower income Canadians. The effect of this was never as good as proponents would want it to be, and particularly the 1960s, the tax system was criticized for being not as progressive as it could have been. But the fact remains that the state was effective in redistributing incomes in this period. And from the 1970s on, the effects of the redistributive effects of the state became controversial and were subject to increasing attacks that by the 1990s were successful in significantly blunting the redistributive effects of the state. So my main motivation in studying the charisma of poverty has been to trace its role in sort of seeding the ground for the neoliberal attacks on redistribution in the decades that followed. Interestingly, redistribution was of almost no interest to people writing about poverty in the 1960s. In fact, you could read almost everything that anybody wrote about poverty in the 1960s and have no idea, if you read nothing else, you'd have no idea that there was any redistribution happening in the period. Poverty was fascinating for reasons other than home ownership. Home ownership was an option for more and more people. So with a large section of the working class better off than previous generations, and especially than the generation of the 1930s, the minority of Canadians who were living in poverty became an object of fascination. This fascination was only partly political in the strict sense. I argue that the attraction of poverty in the period was to a large extent a function of the power of existentialism in the period. To be poor in the 1960s was to live a dangerous life, a life without illusions and without guarantees, which really broke them from the mainstream. So while a good portion of writing of the poor reflected a genuine concern about the poor and a desire to widen the welfare state, even that writing reflects a fascination with the poor as an alien people who have a moral for us to decode for ourselves. So in the early 1960s, up until 66 or 67, when books and articles and films and reports started to proliferate, this idea of the poor as a special people with magic powers, with a charisma that everybody else can learn from, dominated. So I came to this topic in large part because I'm concerned, like a lot of welfare state historians, with the so thanks, Karen and Kate and Marianne, for putting this together and for inviting me here. I've been a postdoc here since late 2013 when I defended my dissertation at Carleton. And I was going to talk about my dissertation in this talk, but I found that I didn't really have time to, so I'm happy to answer questions about it, and especially how it relates to my postdoc, which isn't totally clear probably. But I've been really blessed coming back here to Trent and to Peterborough, where I did my MA and my undergrad. And there's a really great community of people here, and in particular my supervisor Jim Struthers and my office mate Lisa, who's presenting today, have been really great to talk about my research with, but it's nice to have a larger community here to talk to. So my research here at Trent has been on what scholars traditionally have called the rediscovery of poverty, but I call the charisma of poverty. In the 60s, everyone wanted to be associated with poverty and to seem to be authoritative about it. The 1960s was arguably the high point of egalitarian democracy, high rates of unionization, and high rates of education. Access to higher education was unprecedented, and access to... It also hinted at a new perspective on the redistributive state in which programs were seen as a single whole, and bureaucrats in line departments were seen as sort of dangerous empire builders who were building administrative fiefdoms, contributing to a sort of seeding the ground for a neoliberal attack on the welfare state. The Secretariat also worked in partnership with filmmakers working in the National Film Board and with anti-poverty activists, many of them working in the Company of Young Canadians, to produce an amazing amount of material describing and representing poverty, presumably to a population that was not poor. All this material, by explicit design, focused on the particularities of the poor as people, as opposed to the general society and their role in relation to rich people and to the economy as a whole. This project of promoting a cultural understanding of poverty that abstracted the poor from social relations and underscored the authenticity and existential grit of the poor was much more immediately successful than the Secretariat's strategic approach to government, which had to be picked up by later generations of bureaucrats. As I embark on the last few months of my postdoc, it's kind of terrifying to think about that, my research is shifting into the very final stages of the rediscovery of poverty, which is also the end of the 1960s.